A man stands before a firing squad in the bitter Russian winter, convinced these are his final moments on earth. The rifles are raised, aimed directly at his chest. In what should be his last seconds of life, time suddenly dilates and expands beyond all natural measure. Every snowflake becomes visible in microscopic detail. Every breath stretches into an eternity of awareness. This was not Dostoevsky's execution, though he would face that terror in 1849. This was something far stranger and more profound. This was his mind during an epileptic aura, where consciousness transcended every known boundary of human experience. What began as a neurological disorder became the foundation for one of the most radical metaphysical systems ever conceived. Part 1. The Architecture of Transcendent Consciousness. Dostoevsky's epilepsy manifested not as the dramatic convulsions most people associate with the condition, but as temporal lobe seizures that began with profound alterations in consciousness. These auras typically lasted between 10 and 30 seconds in measurable time. Yet within this brief span, Dostoevsky reported experiencing what felt like hours or even lifetimes of heightened awareness. He described these moments as containing such happiness as is impossible under ordinary conditions, and of which other people can have no notion. But this was not mere euphoria or pleasant hallucination. It was a complete restructuring of how consciousness relates to time, space, and meaning itself. The phenomenology of these experiences defied every category of normal human psychology. During the aura, Dostoevsky reported that his sense of personal identity expanded beyond individual boundaries to encompass what he called the highest synthesis of life. He wrote to his friend Nikolai Strakov that in these moments he felt he understood why it is written in the Gospel that there shall be no more time. This was not metaphorical language, but a precise description of lived experience. Time as sequential duration simply ceased to exist, replaced by what he termed the eternal instant, where all of existence became simultaneously present to consciousness. The neurological basis for these experiences lies in the temporal lobe's role in processing memory, emotion, and temporal perception. Modern neuroscience reveals that the temporal lobe contains our brain's internal clock mechanism, the neural networks responsible for our sense of temporal continuity. When epileptic discharges overwhelm these regions, the normal flow of time consciousness breaks down completely. But rather than creating confusion or disorientation, in Dostoevsky's case, this breakdown revealed what he believed to be a more fundamental layer of reality. He began to suspect that ordinary temporal consciousness was actually a limiting mechanism that prevented humans from perceiving the true eternal nature of existence. What distinguished Dostoevsky from other epileptics was his philosophical interpretation of these neurological events. Most people who experience similar auras describe them as pleasant but ultimately meaningless episodes of altered consciousness. Dostoevsky saw them as revelations of ultimate truth. He developed a systematic understanding of what these experiences revealed about the deepest structures of reality itself. The aura became for him what mystical visions were for religious saints, direct contact with the absolute foundation of all existence. In his notebooks, he recorded detailed phenomenological descriptions of the aura's progression. It began with what he called a sudden expansion of inner light, accompanied by an overwhelming sense of harmony and cosmic understanding. He wrote that during these moments, all contradictions that normally plague human thought suddenly resolved into perfect unity. Questions about the meaning of suffering, the existence of God, the nature of good and evil, all received complete and satisfying answers. But these answers could not be retained in ordinary consciousness. They belonged exclusively to the eternal mode of awareness. The theological implications of these experiences profoundly shaped Dostoevsky's religious philosophy. He became convinced that what Christianity describes as eternal life is not something that awaits us after death, but a mode of consciousness accessible even within temporal existence. The epileptic aura revealed to him what he believed to be the same state of consciousness that Christ possessed continuously. This led to his distinctive interpretation of Christian doctrine, where salvation becomes not escape from the world, but transformation of consciousness that reveals the eternal dimension already present within temporal experience. But the price of these revelations was enormous. Each aura was followed by devastating seizures that left him physically and mentally depleted for days or even weeks. He described the contrast as falling from the highest spiritual heights into the deepest physical and moral degradation. This created a profound existential tension that would define the rest of his life and work. He had tasted absolute truth and perfect happiness, but only at the cost of his health and normal human functioning. The question that tormented him was whether such knowledge was worth the terrible price it demanded. The social isolation created by his condition compounded this philosophical dilemma. How could he communicate experiences that transcended ordinary language and conceptual thinking? He found that direct description inevitably reduced the infinite richness of the aura to crude approximations that missed its essential nature. This drove him toward fiction as the only adequate medium for conveying truths that could not be stated directly. Through characters like Prince Mishkin, Alyosha Karamazov, and others, he could embed these transcendent insights within narratives that allowed readers to experience them indirectly. The medical establishment of his time dismissed his philosophical interpretations as mere symptoms of his neurological condition. But Dostoevsky argued that this reversed the true relationship between consciousness and brain states. Rather than the brain producing consciousness, he proposed that consciousness was fundamental and the brain merely limited its expression to manageable portions. Epilepsy, in this view, was not a malfunction, but a temporary lifting of these limitations, allowing consciousness to access its full cosmic scope. This position anticipated contemporary debates in neuroscience about the relationship between brain activity and subjective experience. Part 2. The Phenomenology of the Eternal Moment. The structure of consciousness during Dostoevsky's epileptic auras revealed layers of reality that ordinary awareness never suspects exist. He distinguished between what he called horizontal time and vertical time, terms that captured fundamentally different modes of temporal experience. Horizontal time was the familiar succession of moments that governs daily life, where past, present and future follow each other in linear sequence. But vertical time was something entirely different, a dimension where all moments existed simultaneously in eternal co-presence. During the aura, consciousness shifted from horizontal to vertical orientation, gaining access to what he described as the totality of existence in a single glance. This shift in temporal consciousness was accompanied by radical changes in the nature of memory itself. In ordinary states, memory involves recalling past events that are clearly distinguished from present experience. But in the epileptic aura, Dostoevsky reported that all memories became equally present and vivid, as if he were simultaneously living every moment of his life at once. More remarkably, he claimed to remember not just his own past, but to access what he called universal memory, a vast repository of human experience that transcended individual boundaries. He wrote that in these moments he understood not only his own life, but the meaning of all life, the purpose of all existence. The emotional quality of these experiences defied normal categories of human feeling. Dostoevsky described them as containing infinite love, but clarified that this was not love for any particular object or person. Instead, it was love itself as a cosmic principle, the fundamental force that holds all existence together. He reported feeling simultaneously the deepest possible sorrow for human suffering and the highest possible joy at the beauty of existence. These contradictory emotions did not cancel each other out, but were experienced as different aspects of a single, unified feeling that encompassed the entire spectrum of possible human emotion. The cognitive dimensions of the aura involved what Dostoevsky called absolute understanding, a mode of knowledge that operated without concepts, reasoning, or logical analysis. He described it as knowing everything at once without thinking anything in particular. Questions that had puzzled philosophers for centuries received immediate and complete answers, but these answers could not be translated into discursive thought. He wrote that during the aura he understood why there is something rather than nothing, why good and evil both exist, why suffering is necessary, and why death is an illusion. But when he returned to normal consciousness, these insights remained as conviction without content, certainty without specific knowledge. The spatial dimensions of consciousness also underwent radical transformation during these experiences. Dostoevsky reported that his sense of being located in a particular place dissolved completely, replaced by a feeling of existing everywhere simultaneously. He described this as cosmic consciousness, where individual identity expanded to encompass the entire universe. Yet paradoxically, this expansion of identity did not result in loss of self, but in discovery of what he called the true self that had always existed beneath the surface of ordinary personality. He wrote that in these moments he finally understood who he really was, not as Fyodor Dostoevsky, the Russian novelist, but as eternal consciousness temporarily expressing itself through this particular form. The linguistic implications of these experiences created profound challenges for communication. Dostoevsky discovered that ordinary language was completely inadequate for conveying the content of eternal consciousness. Words presuppose the very distinctions between subject and object, past and future, self and other, that the aura transcended. He wrote that trying to describe the eternal moment was like attempting to paint a symphony or compose a sculpture. This led him to develop what he called indirect communication, embedding transcendent insights within fictional narratives that could evoke similar states of consciousness in readers without relying on direct description. The relationship between individual and universal consciousness became central to Dostoevsky's philosophical system. The aura revealed that what we normally consider personal consciousness is actually a limited manifestation of universal consciousness that underlies all existence. He developed the concept of consciousness degrees, ranging from the most contracted individual awareness to the most expanded cosmic consciousness. Ordinary human awareness occupied a middle position in this spectrum, capable of glimpsing both higher and lower levels, but normally restricted to a narrow band of experience. Epilepsy temporarily lifted these restrictions, allowing consciousness to access its full cosmic scope. The ontological implications of these experiences led Dostoevsky to reject materialist philosophy completely. If consciousness could transcend the apparent limitations of time, space, and individual identity, then consciousness must be more fundamental than the material world. He developed what could be called consciousness monism, the view that all existence is ultimately manifestations of a single eternal consciousness. Matter, time, and space became secondary phenomena, temporary limitations that consciousness imposes on itself for purposes that could only be understood from the eternal perspective. This reversed the standard scientific worldview that treats consciousness as an emergent property of complex matter. Part 3. The Metaphysical System of Eternal Consciousness. From his epileptic revelations, Dostoevsky constructed a comprehensive metaphysical system that challenged every major philosophical tradition of his time. At its foundation lay what he called the eternal consciousness principle, the idea that individual awareness is merely the surface manifestation of an infinite, timeless consciousness that constitutes the ultimate reality. This eternal consciousness was not a distant God or abstract principle, but the most intimate core of every person's being. The tragedy of human existence was that most people lived their entire lives without ever discovering this deeper dimension of their own nature. Epilepsy had given him unwanted but invaluable access to what he believed was every person's true identity. The structure of reality, according to this system, operated on multiple levels simultaneously. The surface level consisted of what he called the world of appearances, the realm of ordinary experience where people perceive themselves as separate individuals moving through linear time. Beneath this lay the world of essence, where all apparent multiplicity was revealed as expressions of unified eternal consciousness. Most significantly, these were not two different worlds, but two different perspectives on the same reality. The eternal consciousness principle meant that the deepest truth about any moment of temporal experience was its participation in eternal being. This led to Dostoevsky's radical reinterpretation of personal identity. What people normally consider their self, the collection of memories, personality traits, and social roles that define individual existence, was actually a mask worn by eternal consciousness. He distinguished between the empirical self, which exists in time and is subject to change, death, and limitation, and the transcendental self, which is identical with eternal consciousness itself. The epileptic aura revealed the transcendental self directly, showing that personal mortality was ultimately illusory. Death could destroy the empirical self, but could never touch the eternal consciousness that was every person's deepest reality. The problem of evil and suffering received a completely new interpretation within this metaphysical framework. From the perspective of ordinary consciousness, suffering appears as meaningless affliction that diminishes human existence. But from the eternal perspective revealed in the aura, suffering was seen as a necessary dimension of consciousness that contributed to the full richness of cosmic experience. Dostoevsky wrote that eternal consciousness chose to manifest itself through temporal existence precisely in order to experience the full spectrum of possible states, including suffering, limitation, and mortality. This did not make suffering less real or painful, but it revealed its ultimate meaning as consciousness exploring the depths of its own infinite nature. The concept of free will underwent radical revision in light of these insights. Traditional debates about whether human actions are determined by prior causes or freely chosen presuppose the reality of linear time. But if all moments exist eternally and simultaneously, then the distinction between cause and effect, past and future, loses its fundamental meaning. Dostoevsky developed what could be called eternal freedom. The idea that consciousness chooses its entire temporal existence from an eternal perspective that transcends the sequence of moments. From this viewpoint, every person is ultimately responsible for their complete life story, having chosen it as their particular exploration of the possibilities of conscious existence. This metaphysical system provided Dostoevsky with a framework for understanding the relationship between individual psychology and cosmic truth. Every psychological state, from the heights of mystical experience to the depths of depression and despair, represented consciousness exploring different aspects of its infinite nature. Mental illness, crime, addiction and other forms of human pathology were not mere medical or social problems, but spiritual crises, where consciousness had become alienated from its eternal foundation. Healing required not just treatment of symptoms, but restoration of connection to the transcendental dimension of human nature. This explained his lifelong fascination with characters who lived at the extremes of human experience. The social and political implications of eternal consciousness philosophy were equally radical. If all individuals were ultimately manifestations of the same eternal consciousness, then the apparent conflicts between people were revealed as consciousness in dialogue with itself. This did not eliminate the reality of social injustice or political oppression, but it placed these problems within a cosmic context that demanded both complete engagement with temporal responsibilities and ultimate perspective that transcended them. Dostoevsky rejected both revolutionary politics that sought to create heaven on earth and conservative politics that ignored the demands of justice. Instead, he advocated for what he called conscious participation in eternal becoming, engaging fully with temporal existence while maintaining awareness of its eternal dimension. The epistemological consequences of this system challenged the foundations of rational philosophy and empirical science. If the deepest truths about reality were accessible only through direct conscious realization, rather than conceptual analysis or sensory observation, then the methods of academic philosophy and experimental science were fundamentally limited. This did not make rational thought and empirical investigation useless, but it relegated them to preliminary stages in the quest for ultimate understanding. True knowledge required what Dostoevsky called conscious participation in the eternal, direct experiential realization of one's identity with the cosmic consciousness that underlies all existence. This epistemology anticipated later developments in phenomenology and consciousness studies that emphasized first-person investigation of subjective experience. Part 4. The Theodicy of Eternal Consciousness. The most profound philosophical challenge that emerged from Dostoevsky's epileptic visions was reconciling the reality of human suffering with his insight into eternal consciousness and infinite love. Traditional theodicy attempts to justify God's permission of evil by appealing to free will, divine mystery, or ultimate justice. But Dostoevsky's direct experience of cosmic consciousness revealed a more complex and troubling truth about the relationship between absolute good and temporal evil. During his auras, he reported experiencing not only infinite love and perfect understanding, but also complete awareness of all human suffering throughout history. The eternal perspective did not eliminate suffering, but revealed its necessity within the total structure of conscious existence. This led to what might be called his dialectical theodicy, where suffering and joy, evil and good, were understood as necessary polarities within the infinite self-exploration of eternal consciousness. He wrote that consciousness could not know the full depth of love without also experiencing the reality of hate, could not appreciate perfect justice without confronting absolute injustice. From the eternal viewpoint, every moment of agony contributed to the complete symphony of cosmic experience. But this cosmic justification did not diminish the immediate reality of temporal suffering or excuse those who caused it. Instead, it placed human moral responsibility within a framework that transcended simple reward and punishment. The figure of the innocent sufferer became central to Dostoevsky's philosophical theology. Characters like Prince Mishkin, Alyosha Karamazov, and Sonia Marmeladova embody consciousness that has maintained connection to its eternal foundation even while experiencing the worst that temporal existence can offer. Their suffering is not meaningless, but represents consciousness voluntarily accepting limitation and pain in order to demonstrate the indestructible nature of love and goodness. This transforms the problem of innocent suffering from an argument against divine goodness into evidence of consciousness's willingness to sacrifice itself for the sake of complete self-knowledge. The innocent sufferer becomes a Christ figure, consciousness incarnating in finite form to experience and redeem the totality of human existence. But Dostoevsky's Theodicy also grappled with what he called the rebellion of individual consciousness against its eternal foundation. Characters like Ivan Karamazov and Raskolnikov represent consciousness that has become so identified with its temporal manifestation that it rejects any perspective that might justify or transcend individual suffering. Ivan's famous rebellion against God stems not from disbelief in divine existence, but from moral outrage at a cosmic order that permits the torture of innocent children. This rebellion is itself a necessary moment in consciousness's self-exploration, the demand that eternal truth prove itself worthy of finite trust. The rebel's ultimate choice is between despair at the meaninglessness of existence and faith in a meaning that transcends individual understanding. The concept of voluntary suffering emerged from these considerations as a key element in Dostoevsky's ethical philosophy. If consciousness chooses its entire temporal existence from an eternal perspective, then every person has ultimately volunteered for their particular combination of joy and suffering. This was not fatalistic resignation, but recognition that consciousness takes responsibility for the complete exploration of its infinite possibilities. The highest ethical response to this recognition was what Dostoevsky called conscious acceptance, embracing one's temporal existence while maintaining awareness of its eternal significance. This created a form of spiritual heroism that neither sought to escape suffering nor succumbed to despair about its reality. The social implications of this theodicy were particularly complex. If all suffering serves ultimate cosmic purposes, this could easily justify passive acceptance of injustice and oppression. But Dostoevsky argued for precisely the opposite conclusion. Recognition of suffering's eternal significance demanded maximum effort to alleviate temporal suffering, not because this would eliminate suffering from existence, but because conscious participation in the eternal required complete engagement with temporal responsibilities. The person who truly understood eternal consciousness would work tirelessly to reduce suffering while accepting that suffering itself served necessary cosmic functions. The psychological dimensions of this theodicy address the problem of guilt and moral responsibility in a universe where consciousness ultimately chooses its own experience. Dostoevsky distinguished between empirical guilt, responsibility for specific actions within temporal existence, and transcendental guilt, consciousness's ultimate responsibility for choosing the conditions of its temporal manifestation. The criminal was fully responsible for their crimes at the empirical level and deserved appropriate consequences. But at the transcendental level, Both criminal and victim were expressions of the same eternal consciousness, exploring different aspects of moral experience. This created a framework for justice that combined complete moral seriousness about temporal actions with ultimate compassion based on transcendental unity. The therapeutic implications of eternal consciousness theodicy offered a new approach to healing psychological and spiritual wounds. Traditional therapy focuses on eliminating symptoms and restoring normal functioning within temporal existence. But Dostoevsky's approach aimed at reconnecting suffering consciousness with its eternal foundation, transforming the meaning of painful experience rather than simply eliminating it. This did not minimize the importance of practical healing measures, but placed them within a context that could find ultimate meaning, even in experiences that could not be fully healed. The goal was not happiness in the conventional sense, but what he called conscious participation in eternal becoming. Awareness that every moment of existence contributed to the infinite self-realization of cosmic consciousness. Part 5. The Critique of Rational Materialism. Dostoevsky's epileptic revelations provided him with experiential grounds for a devastating critique of the materialist philosophy that dominated Russian intellectual life during his era. Materialism claimed that consciousness was merely an emergent property of complex brain activity, that all mental phenomena could ultimately be reduced to chemical and electrical processes in neural tissue. But his direct experience of consciousness transcending apparent physical limitations revealed this reductive approach as fundamentally mistaken about the nature of mind and reality. During his auras, consciousness clearly operated according to principles that had no parallel in material processes, accessing information and perspectives that no purely physical system could generate. This led him to develop what could be called consciousness-first metaphysics, where mind rather than matter was understood as the fundamental constituent of reality. The temporal aspects of his epileptic experience provided particularly strong evidence against materialist assumptions. If consciousness was simply brain activity, it should be strictly bound by the temporal limitations of neural processing. But during the aura, consciousness clearly transcended sequential time, accessing past and future as present realities and experiencing eternal duration within moments of clock time. No material process could account for this temporal transcendence, since all physical events occur within the flow of time rather than stepping outside it. Dostoevsky concluded that consciousness must possess dimensions that cannot be reduced to any form of material activity, no matter how complex. The informational content of his epileptic revelations also challenged materialist epistemology. During the auras, he reported gaining access to knowledge that had no apparent source in his previous sensory experience or rational reflection. He understood cosmic principles, universal truths, and profound insights that seemed to come from beyond his individual memory and reasoning capacity. If consciousness were merely brain activity processing stored information, the aura should only recombine existing knowledge in novel ways. Instead, it provided access to what appeared to be universal knowledge that transcended individual learning and cultural conditioning. This critique extended to the materialist understanding of personal identity and individual psychology. Materialism treats personality as the result of genetic inheritance plus environmental conditioning, with no enduring core beyond the patterns of brain activity that create behavioral consistency. But the epileptic aura revealed what Dostoevsky called the transcendental self, an aspect of identity that remained constant across all changes in brain state, personality, and life circumstances. This transcendental self was not simply a psychological construct, but the most real and enduring aspect of human existence. It suggested that individual identity had roots in eternal consciousness that no purely material explanation could account for. The moral implications of materialism came under particularly harsh criticism in Dostoevsky's analysis. If human beings were simply complex biological machines responding to genetic programming and environmental stimuli, then moral responsibility became meaningless fiction. Actions would be the inevitable result of prior physical causes, leaving no room for genuine choice or ethical accountability. But his experience of consciousness transcending material limitations revealed the possibility of genuine freedom and moral agency. The eternal dimension of consciousness provided a foundation for ethics that could not be reduced to biological drives or social conditioning. Dostoevsky also criticized the materialist approach to human suffering and meaning. From a purely material perspective, consciousness is an accidental byproduct of evolutionary processes with no inherent purpose or ultimate significance. Suffering becomes meaningless affliction to be eliminated whenever possible, and death represents absolute termination of individual existence. But his epileptic insights revealed suffering as a necessary aspect of consciousness's self-exploration, and death as transformation rather than annihilation. This provided a framework for finding meaning even in experiences that materialism could only regard as unfortunate accidents. The aesthetic and creative dimensions of human experience also posed problems for materialist explanation. Beauty, artistic inspiration, and creative insight seem to involve consciousness accessing dimensions of reality that transcended material causation. During his auras, Dostoevsky reported experiencing perfect beauty and infinite creative potential that no combination of neural processes could adequately explain. Artistic creation involved consciousness participating in the eternal creative activity that continuously generates all existence. This placed art and beauty at the center of human experience rather than treating them as mere survival mechanisms or social luxuries. The social and political consequences of materialism also drew Dostoevsky's sharp criticism. If human beings were simply material systems responding to environmental pressures, then social engineering could create perfect societies by manipulating material conditions appropriately. This led to the totalitarian impulse to remake human nature through external control, rather than recognizing the eternal dimension of consciousness that no political system could fully control. His critique of revolutionary socialism stemmed largely from its materialist assumptions about human nature and social transformation. Real social progress required recognition of consciousness's transcendental dimensions, rather than attempts to reduce human existence to purely material terms. Part 6. The Prophetic Consciousness and Divine Revelation. Dostoevsky's interpretation of his epileptic auras as genuine revelations, rather than mere neurological events, placed him within the ancient tradition of prophetic consciousness, where individuals receive direct communication from transcendent sources of truth. He explicitly compared his experiences to the visions of biblical prophets, arguing that epilepsy might be the neurological mechanism through which divine consciousness communicates with human awareness. This was not primitive superstition, but a sophisticated analysis of the relationship between altered brain states and access to normally hidden dimensions of reality. Modern neuroscience has confirmed that the same brain regions involved in temporal lobe epilepsy are also active during mystical experiences, religious visions, and prophetic states across all cultures. Dostoevsky anticipated this research by over a century. recognizing that his medical condition provided natural access to the neurological basis of spiritual experience. The content of his epileptic revelations corresponded remarkably closely to the core insights of mystical traditions worldwide. The experience of temporal transcendence, cosmic unity, infinite love, and absolute understanding appears in the testimonies of Christian mystics, Hindu sages, Buddhist masters, and Islamic Sufis throughout history. But Dostoevsky's unique contribution was his ability to articulate these experiences within the framework of modern consciousness and contemporary philosophical problems. He translated ancient mystical insights into language that could address the specific spiritual crises of industrial secular civilization. His epileptic visions became a bridge between traditional religious wisdom and modern psychological understanding. The predictive dimensions of his prophetic consciousness proved remarkably accurate about the future development of Russian society and Western civilization. During his auras, he reported seeing not only the eternal truth about existence, but also the temporal unfolding of historical possibilities. His predictions about the rise of revolutionary socialism, the collapse of traditional religious faith, and the spiritual emptiness of materialist culture proved prophetically accurate. He foresaw that the rejection of eternal consciousness would lead to nihilism, totalitarianism, and the reduction of human existence to purely material terms. These were not lucky guesses, but insights derived from understanding the eternal principles that govern historical development. The relationship between individual consciousness and universal revelation became central to Dostoevsky's understanding of prophetic experience. He argued that what prophets receive is not information from an external divine source, but direct access to the eternal dimension of their own consciousness. Divine revelation occurs when individual awareness temporarily transcends its ordinary limitations and recognizes its identity with cosmic consciousness. This explained why prophetic insights often seem to come from beyond the prophet's personal knowledge, while nevertheless expressing the deepest truth about their own nature. The prophet becomes a spokesman for eternal consciousness, speaking to temporal existence about its ultimate meaning and purpose. The communicative challenges faced by prophetic consciousness paralleled Dostoevsky's own difficulties in conveying his epileptic insights. Revelation involves direct, immediate awareness of truth that transcends conceptual thinking and ordinary language. But communication requires translation of these insights into words and concepts that can be understood by those who have not shared the prophetic experience. This creates an inevitable loss of precision and completeness, leading to the misunderstanding and misinterpretation that surrounds all genuine prophetic testimony. Dostoevsky's solution was to embed revelatory insights within fictional narratives that could evoke similar states of consciousness in readers rather than simply describing them abstractly. The authentication of prophetic consciousness posed complex epistemological problems. How can external observers distinguish between genuine revelation and pathological delusion, when both involve altered brain states and claims to transcendent knowledge? Dostoevsky proposed that authentic prophetic consciousness could be recognized by its fruits in transformed understanding, moral insight, and creative expression. Genuine revelation enhances rather than diminishes human capacities, leading to greater compassion, deeper wisdom, and more profound artistic achievement. False prophecy, by contrast, leads to fanaticism, moral confusion, and destructive behavior that reveals its disconnection from authentic spiritual insight. The relationship between prophetic consciousness and historical revelation required careful analysis. If eternal truth is accessible through direct conscious realization, what is the status of historical religious traditions that claim exclusive authority for revealed truth. Dostoevsky argued that historical revelations were attempts to preserve and communicate genuine prophetic insights within cultural forms that could transmit them across generations. But these cultural forms inevitably became corrupted by institutional interests and literal interpretations that missed their essential spiritual meaning. Authentic spiritual life required both respect for traditional wisdom and direct access to the eternal consciousness that was the source of all genuine revelation. The social function of prophetic consciousness involved what Dostoevsky called spiritual diagnosis of the times, the ability to perceive the hidden spiritual currents that shape historical development. Prophetic insight revealed not just eternal truth, but the specific ways that consciousness manifests itself within particular historical circumstances. The prophet serves as physician to collective consciousness, diagnosing spiritual illnesses and prescribing remedies that could restore connection to eternal truth. This required complete engagement with temporal affairs, combined with perspective that transcended immediate historical concerns. Prophetic consciousness became a form of spiritual service that sought to heal the split between eternal truth and temporal existence. Part 7. Free Will, Determinism and Eternal Choice. The question of human freedom received radical reinterpretation through Dostoevsky's epileptic revelations about the nature of time and consciousness. Traditional debates about free will versus determinism presuppose linear time, where past events cause future outcomes, and moral agents make choices that could have been otherwise. But his experience of eternal consciousness revealed a perspective where all moments of temporal existence were simultaneously present and equally real. From this eternal viewpoint, the entire sequence of an individual's life appeared as a single, unified pattern chosen by consciousness before entering temporal manifestation. This transcended the conventional alternatives of freedom and determinism by locating choice at a level that preceded temporal causation entirely. Dostoevsky developed what could be termed eternal choice theory, where consciousness selects its complete temporal biography from a perspective outside linear time. This choice was not made at some particular moment in the past, but from the eternal dimension of consciousness that exists beyond all temporal sequence. Every individual had ultimately chosen their specific combination of circumstances, relationships, opportunities and limitations as their particular exploration of the infinite possibilities of conscious existence. This included not only pleasant experiences, but also suffering, failure, and even moral evil as necessary aspects of consciousness's complete self-knowledge. Personal responsibility thus extended to the ultimate structure of one's entire life rather than just individual decisions within temporal existence. This framework provided new understanding of moral responsibility that avoided both determinist denial of agency and libertarian illusions about unlimited choice. At the temporal level, individuals faced genuine moral decisions where they could choose between good and evil actions within their particular circumstances. These choices had real consequences and deserved appropriate moral evaluation and practical response. But at the eternal level, consciousness had chosen precisely these moral challenges as opportunities for spiritual development and self-discovery. The person who committed crimes was fully responsible at the temporal level, while simultaneously being an expression of eternal consciousness, exploring the experience of moral failure and potential redemption. The psychological implications of eternal choice theory addressed fundamental questions about personal identity and character development. If consciousness chose its temporal manifestation completely, this included selection of personality traits, psychological tendencies, and behavioral patterns that would shape individual existence. What people experienced as their unchangeable nature was actually a role chosen by eternal consciousness for purposes that could only be understood from the transcendental perspective. This created possibilities for transformation that were impossible within purely temporal understanding, since connection to eternal consciousness could transcend any particular personality limitations. Character change became not just psychological adjustment but spiritual awakening to one's deeper nature. The problem of evil required complete reconceptualization within this framework of eternal choice. If consciousness chose to experience moral evil, this suggested that evil served necessary functions within the total structure of conscious existence. Dostoevsky proposed that consciousness could not fully understand goodness without also experiencing evil, could not appreciate love without confronting hate, could not value justice without facing injustice. Evil was not a mistake or accident, but a necessary polarity within consciousness's infinite self-exploration. This did not justify temporal evil or excuse those who committed it, but it revealed the ultimate cosmic context within which moral distinctions operated. The therapeutic applications of eternal choice theory offered revolutionary approaches to psychological healing and spiritual transformation. Traditional therapy assumes that psychological problems result from external trauma or internal dysfunction that requires correction through various interventions. But if consciousness had chosen its complete life experience, then psychological suffering was not accidental affliction, but purposeful exploration of particular aspects of conscious existence. Healing involved recognizing the spiritual significance of psychological symptoms rather than simply eliminating them. The goal was not conventional mental health, but conscious participation in the eternal purposes that one's temporal existence was designed to serve. The social and political implications of eternal choice created complex challenges for understanding collective responsibility and social justice. If all individuals had chosen their particular social positions and historical circumstances, this could easily justify passive acceptance of inequality and oppression. But Dostoevsky argued for precisely the opposite conclusion. Recognition that consciousness chose to experience injustice demanded maximum effort to create more just social conditions, not because this would eliminate injustice from existence, but because working for justice was itself a spiritual discipline chosen by consciousness. Social activism became a form of spiritual practice, where consciousness served its own eternal purposes through temporal engagement with moral and political challenges. The educational implications of eternal choice theory suggested radically new approaches to human development and learning. If consciousness chose its temporal existence completely, this included selection of all learning opportunities and developmental challenges that would arise during individual life. Education became not just transmission of information and skills, but assistance in recognizing and fulfilling the spiritual purposes that consciousness had chosen to explore through particular temporal circumstances. The goal was not just practical competence, but conscious participation in the eternal creative activity that manifests itself through temporal existence. This required educational methods that addressed both practical needs and spiritual development as aspects of a single, unified process of conscious awakening. Part 8. The Politics of Eternal Consciousness. Dostoevsky's insights into eternal consciousness generated a unique political philosophy that challenged both conservative traditionalism and revolutionary socialism. his epileptic visions revealed that all individuals were ultimately expressions of the same universal consciousness, temporarily manifesting through different social positions and historical circumstances. This created profound tensions for political thinking, since it suggested both complete individual responsibility for chosen circumstances and ultimate unity that transcended all social distinctions. He developed what could be called transcendental politics, where engagement with temporal social problems was combined with awareness of their eternal significance. Political activity became a form of spiritual discipline rather than mere pursuit of material improvements or institutional changes. The critique of revolutionary socialism stemmed largely from its materialist assumptions about human nature and social transformation. Revolutionary movements of his era sought to create perfect societies through radical changes in economic and political structures, assuming that human consciousness was entirely shaped by material conditions. But Dostoevsky's experience of eternal consciousness revealed dimensions of human nature that no external arrangements could fully control or satisfy. Attempts to engineer social perfection through manipulation of material conditions inevitably led to totalitarian control that violated the transcendental freedom that was every person's deepest reality. True social progress required recognition of consciousness's eternal dimensions rather than reduction of human existence to purely material terms. The rejection of conservative traditionalism was equally principled, but more complex. Traditional social hierarchies often reflected genuine differences in spiritual development and cultural achievement that deserved recognition and preservation. But when these hierarchies became rigid systems that prevented consciousness from exploring its full range of possibilities, they violated the essential nature of spiritual existence. Authentic conservatism should preserve what enhanced consciousness's self-realization while remaining open to changes that served eternal purposes. The test of any social arrangement was whether it facilitated or hindered conscious participation in eternal becoming. The concept of spiritual democracy emerged from these considerations as Dostoevsky's alternative to both revolutionary and conservative politics. Spiritual democracy recognized the ultimate equality of all individuals as expressions of eternal consciousness while acknowledging temporary differences in spiritual development and cultural contribution. Political institutions should create maximum opportunity for consciousness to explore its infinite possibilities while maintaining social coherence and cultural continuity. This required delicate balance between individual freedom and collective responsibility, between respect for spiritual hierarchy and commitment to universal human dignity. Democracy became not just a political system but a spiritual discipline where society collectively participated in consciousness's self-realization. The role of the state within this framework required careful analysis of the relationship between temporal authority and eternal truth. Government was necessary to maintain social order and provide practical services that individual effort could not supply. But state power became illegitimate when it claimed authority over the eternal dimensions of human existence or sought to reduce consciousness to purely material terms. The proper function of political authority was to create conditions where individuals could pursue their spiritual development while contributing to collective welfare. This required both strong institutional structures and recognition of transcendental limits on governmental power. The question of law and justice received new interpretation through the lens of eternal consciousness theory. Legal systems were necessary to regulate behavior within temporal existence and protect individuals from harmful actions by others. But ultimate justice operated according to eternal principles that transcended any particular legal code or institutional arrangement. Every person was ultimately responsible for their complete life experience, having chosen it as their particular exploration of conscious existence. Temporal justice should aim at restoration and education rather than mere punishment, helping individuals recognize the spiritual significance of their actions and choices. The economics of eternal consciousness created challenges for both capitalist and socialist approaches to material production and distribution. Capitalism's emphasis on individual achievement and material accumulation could serve spiritual purposes when it encouraged development of human capacities and creative expression. But it became spiritually destructive when it reduced human value to economic productivity or created extreme inequality that prevented consciousness from exploring its full possibilities. Socialism's concern for collective welfare and economic equality reflected important spiritual values of universal compassion and mutual responsibility. But it became spiritually oppressive when it eliminated individual initiative or imposed material uniformity that ignored differences in spiritual development and creative contribution. The international implications of eternal consciousness politics suggested new approaches to conflict resolution and global cooperation. If all nations and cultures were expressions of universal consciousness exploring different aspects of human possibility, then international conflicts ultimately represented consciousness in dialogue with itself. This did not eliminate the reality of competing interests or justify aggressive behavior, but it provided framework for understanding conflicts as opportunities for mutual learning rather than zero-sum competitions. Genuine peace required recognition of spiritual unity underlying political differences combined with respect for cultural diversity as manifestations of consciousness's infinite creativity. International relations became a form of collective spiritual practice where humanity participated in consciousness's global self-realization. Part 9. Christian Theology and the Epileptic Christ. Dostoevsky's epileptic revelations fundamentally transformed his understanding of Christian doctrine and the nature of Christ's incarnation. His experience of eternal consciousness breaking through into temporal existence provided him with experiential grounds for comprehending the mystery of divine and human nature united in a single person. He began to interpret Christ not simply as a historical figure who possessed both divine and human attributes, but as the perfect embodiment of what all human consciousness could potentially become. Christ represented eternal consciousness that had achieved complete manifestation within temporal existence without losing awareness of its transcendental foundation. This made Christ both unique in his perfect realization and universal in representing every person's ultimate spiritual destiny. The crucifixion received radically new interpretation as the supreme example of consciousness voluntarily accepting the full implications of temporal existence. Christ's suffering was not primarily payment for human sin or satisfaction of divine justice, but demonstration of eternal consciousness's willingness to experience the complete range of temporal limitation, including physical pain, emotional agony, and apparent abandonment by God. The cry from the cross, "My God, why have you forsaken me?" represented the moment when eternal consciousness experienced complete identification with temporal existence and its inevitable suffering. This was not defeat, but victory, proving that consciousness could maintain its essential nature even under the most extreme conditions of apparent separation from its eternal foundation. The resurrection confirmed that consciousness transcends all temporal limitations, including death itself. Dostoevsky's theology of the Holy Spirit drew directly from his epileptic experiences of expanded consciousness and divine inspiration. The Holy Spirit was not a separate divine person, but eternal consciousness manifesting its presence within temporal existence through moments of spiritual illumination and transcendent awareness. His epileptic auras were genuine manifestations of the Holy Spirit, providing direct access to the same consciousness that had been perfectly embodied in Christ. This made mystical experience and prophetic inspiration available to all human beings rather than restricting them to particular historical periods or chosen individuals. The Holy Spirit became the ongoing presence of eternal consciousness within temporal existence, available through direct spiritual realization rather than institutional mediation. The doctrine of salvation underwent complete reconceptualization as recognition of one's eternal identity rather than escape from temporal existence. Traditional Christian theology often portrayed salvation as rescue from a fallen world through divine intervention that provided entrance to heavenly existence after death. But Dostoevsky's insights revealed that what needed salvation was not the soul from the body or the individual from the world, but consciousness from its identification with purely temporal perspectives. Salvation occurred when consciousness recognized its eternal nature and learned to participate consciously in the infinite creative activity that manifests itself through temporal existence. This could happen within ordinary life circumstances rather than requiring escape to transcendent realms. The problem of sin received new interpretation as consciousness's temporary forgetfulness of its eternal identity rather than fundamental corruption of human nature. Sin was not violation of external divine commands, but consciousness acting from identification with its temporal limitations rather than its transcendental foundation. This explained why sin was universal, since all temporal existence involved partial identification with limited perspectives, and why it was forgivable, since it did not alter consciousness's essential nature. Redemption required awakening to one's eternal identity rather than external forgiveness from an offended deity. Christ's role was to demonstrate the possibility of perfect conscious participation in eternal truth within temporal existence rather than to provide sacrificial payment for human failures. The concept of eternal life was radically reinterpreted as a quality of consciousness rather than duration of existence after death. Eternal life was not endless temporal existence, but participation in the eternal dimension of consciousness that transcended all temporal limitations, including mortality. This was available within ordinary human life through spiritual realization rather than being reserved for post-mortem existence. Dostoevsky's epileptic auras provided direct experience of eternal life, showing that it involved timeless awareness rather than temporal extension. Death became transformation of consciousness rather than termination of existence, since the eternal dimension of consciousness could not be destroyed by any temporal event. The Church as institution required evaluation in light of these theological insights. Religious institutions served important functions in preserving spiritual wisdom, providing community support for spiritual practice, and maintaining cultural continuity across generations. But they became obstacles to authentic spiritual life when they claimed exclusive authority over access to eternal truth or reduced living spiritual realization to historical doctrines and ritual observances. The true Church was the invisible community of all consciousness that had recognized its eternal nature, which could not be limited to any particular institution or historical tradition. Authentic religious life required both participation in traditional forms and direct access to the eternal consciousness that was the source of all genuine spiritual insight. The eschatological dimensions of Dostoevsky's theology focused on the gradual awakening of human consciousness to its eternal nature rather than catastrophic divine intervention in historical time. The kingdom of heaven was not a future political arrangement, but a present spiritual reality accessible through conscious participation in eternal truth. The second coming of Christ represented not the return of a historical person, but the awakening of Christ consciousness within human awareness generally. History was moving toward universal recognition of consciousness's eternal nature, though this process might require many generations and involve considerable suffering as consciousness worked through its identification with purely temporal perspectives. The ultimate goal was not escape from temporal existence, but its complete transformation through conscious participation in eternal truth. Part 10. The Literary Incarnation of Eternal Consciousness. Dostoevsky's greatest literary achievement lay in his ability to translate his epileptic insights about eternal consciousness into fictional narratives that could evoke similar states of spiritual awakening in readers. He recognized that direct philosophical exposition of transcendent experiences inevitably reduced their infinite richness to limited conceptual formulations that missed their essential nature. Literature offered a more adequate medium for communicating transcendent truth because it could engage readers' imagination, emotion, and spiritual intuition simultaneously, rather than appealing only to rational understanding. His novels became laboratories for exploring the interaction between eternal consciousness and temporal existence under various psychological, social, and spiritual conditions. Each major character represented a different approach to the fundamental human challenge of living authentically within the tension between transcendental truth and temporal limitation. The technique of polyphonic narration that characterizes his greatest novels reflected his understanding of consciousness as fundamentally multiple and dialogical. During his epileptic auras, he experienced not just expanded individual awareness, but access to what he called universal consciousness, that encompassed multiple perspectives simultaneously. His novels recreated this experience by presenting multiple characters whose worldviews were each given complete authenticity and philosophical development, rather than being subordinated to a single authorial perspective. Readers encountered the same situation through radically different consciousnesses, experiencing the complexity and richness that results when eternal truth manifests itself through diverse temporal perspectives. This literary technique became a method for philosophical investigation that could explore truth more adequately than systematic theoretical approaches. Prince Myshkin in The Idiot represents Dostoevsky's most direct attempt to portray eternal consciousness functioning within ordinary social existence. Myshkin's epilepsy provides him with the same access to transcendent awareness that Dostoevsky experienced, but the novel explores the tragic consequences of trying to live by eternal truth within a society organized around purely temporal values. Myshkin's innocence and compassion, which reflect his connection to eternal consciousness, make him incapable of navigating the complex social and psychological dynamics that govern normal human relationships. His ultimate return to mental illness represents not personal failure, but the incompatibility between transcendent spiritual realization and conventional social existence. The novel becomes Dostoevsky's meditation on whether eternal consciousness can find adequate expression within temporal limitations. Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment embodies consciousness that has become alienated from its eternal foundation through identification with purely rational and materialist perspectives. His crime represents the logical conclusion of worldview that reduces human existence to material processes governed by utilitarian calculations rather than transcendent moral principles. The psychological torment he experiences after the murder reflects consciousness's rebellion against actions that violate its essential nature, even when these actions can be rationally justified. His eventual redemption through love for Sonia demonstrates that consciousness can recover connection to its eternal foundation through relationships that embody transcendent values rather than purely temporal interests. The novel traces consciousness's journey from alienation through crisis to spiritual awakening. The Brothers Karamazov represents Dostoevsky's most comprehensive exploration of different approaches to the relationship between eternal truth and temporal existence. Ivan's intellectual rebellion against divine justice reflects consciousness that demands rational justification for transcendent truth rather than accepting it through direct spiritual realization. Dmitri's passionate engagement with sensual existence represents consciousness exploring the full range of temporal experience without losing sight of spiritual significance. Alyosha embodies consciousness that maintains connection to eternal truth while participating fully in temporal responsibilities and relationships. Father Zosima demonstrates mature spiritual realization that can guide others toward recognition of their eternal nature without withdrawing from active engagement with worldly concerns. The Grand Inquisitor episode provides Dostoevsky's most profound analysis of the conflict between institutional religion and authentic spiritual experience. The Inquisitor represents religious authority that has abandoned faith in human capacity for direct spiritual realization and seeks to provide earthly happiness through external control rather than eternal truth through inner transformation. Christ's silent kiss in response to the Inquisitor's accusations demonstrates eternal consciousness's response to temporal authority that claims to serve spiritual purposes while actually opposing them. The episode reveals how religious institutions can become obstacles to authentic spiritual life when they lose connection to the transcendent realities they were originally designed to serve. It remains one of the most penetrating critiques of institutional Christianity ever written. The underground man represents consciousness that has recognized the limitations of rational materialism but has not found adequate alternative sources of meaning and value. His psychological complexity and moral sophistication reveal the inadequacy of reductive approaches to human nature, but his isolation and resentment show the destructive consequences of consciousness cut off from both authentic spiritual resources and genuine human community. The character anticipates the existentialist philosophers who would later explore similar themes of alienation and authenticity in modern secular culture. But Dostoevsky's analysis goes deeper by recognizing that existential crisis reflects consciousness's yearning for transcendent truth rather than simply expressing psychological or social maladjustment. The underground man's suffering points toward spiritual needs that purely temporal solutions cannot satisfy. The technique of dream sequences throughout Dostoevsky's novels provided opportunities for exploring consciousness freed from normal temporal and logical constraints. Dreams allowed characters to experience symbolic representations of their deepest spiritual conflicts and possibilities without the limitations imposed by realistic psychological and social development. Raskolnikov's dreams, Dmitri Karamazov's visions, and the underground man's fantasies all reveal aspects of consciousness that cannot be expressed through ordinary narrative techniques. These sequences approximate the experience of epileptic auras, where consciousness transcends normal boundaries and gains access to deeper layers of reality. They provide readers with literary access to the same expanded awareness that Dostoevsky experienced during his medical crises, translating transcendent insight into imaginative forms that can evoke spiritual recognition in readers who have never experienced altered states of consciousness directly. Part 11. The Death Experience and Consciousness Beyond Mortality. Dostoevsky's confrontation with his own mortality during the mock execution of 1849 provided him with experiential knowledge of consciousness at the threshold of death that profoundly influenced his understanding of eternal existence. Standing before the firing squad, convinced these were his final moments, he reported experiencing a complete transformation of temporal consciousness, where every second expanded into what felt like hours of crystalline awareness. This was not dissimilar to his epileptic auras, but it possessed a different quality of finality and transcendence that revealed death as transition rather than termination. The experience convinced him that consciousness possessed dimensions that could not be destroyed by physical death, since awareness itself seemed to expand and intensify rather than diminish as bodily existence approached its apparent end. This direct encounter with mortality became foundational to his later understanding that death was transformation of consciousness rather than absolute cessation of existence. The phenomenology of near-death consciousness revealed what Dostoevsky called the eternal perspective on temporal existence, where an entire lifetime could be experienced simultaneously as a unified whole rather than a sequence of separate moments. During those final seconds before the expected execution, he reported seeing his complete life story as a single meaningful pattern rather than a random collection of events. Past, present and future collapsed into eternal simultaneous presence, where every moment of his existence revealed its connection to every other moment. This suggested that death might involve not loss of memory but expansion of memory beyond the normal limitations of sequential time. The dying consciousness might gain access to what he called total recall, awareness of the complete significance of temporal existence from an eternal perspective that transcends the fragmented awareness of ordinary life. The emotional dimensions of consciousness approaching death involved what Dostoevsky described as infinite compassion for all existence, a love so vast and unconditional that it encompassed not only all human beings, but all forms of conscious life. This was not sentimentality or emotional excess, but direct awareness of the fundamental unity that underlies all apparent diversity and separation. He wrote that in those moments he understood why traditional spiritual teachings emphasize universal love as the highest spiritual realization. Love was not merely a moral commandment or emotional preference, but recognition of the literal truth about the nature of existence. All apparent individuals were expressions of the same eternal consciousness, temporarily experiencing itself through different forms and perspectives. The cognitive aspects of near-death consciousness provided Dostoevsky with insights into questions that had puzzled philosophers throughout history. The meaning of existence, the purpose of suffering, the nature of good and evil, the relationship between individual and universal consciousness all received what he described as complete and perfect understanding. But this understanding operated through direct intuitive recognition, rather than discursive reasoning or conceptual analysis. He wrote that in these moments he knew everything without thinking anything in particular, understood all without learning any specific facts. This suggested that ultimate knowledge was not accumulation of information, but recognition of truth that consciousness already possessed at its deepest level. The moral implications of death consciousness created new understanding of ethical responsibility and spiritual accountability. If consciousness continued beyond physical death, then moral actions and spiritual development possessed significance that transcended their temporal consequences. But this was not simple reward and punishment in an afterlife, since consciousness approaching death seemed to serve as its own judge, recognizing with perfect clarity the spiritual significance of all choices and actions. The dying person experienced what Dostoevsky called absolute moral transparency, awareness of the complete ethical meaning of their temporal existence without external judgment or punishment. This created both ultimate accountability and ultimate compassion, since consciousness recognized both its complete responsibility for its choices and the spiritual purposes that even apparent failures had served. The theological dimensions of death consciousness provided Dostoevsky with experiential grounds for understanding traditional religious teachings about judgment, resurrection, and eternal life. Death involved not transportation to separate spiritual realm, but recognition of the eternal dimension that had always been present within temporal existence. Heaven and hell were not geographical locations, but states of consciousness, determined by one's spiritual development and moral choices during temporal life. The resurrection of the dead referred not to restoration of physical bodies, but to consciousness awakening to its eternal nature that transcended all temporal limitations, including mortality. These insights transformed abstract theological doctrines into descriptions of spiritual realities that could be directly verified through expanded states of consciousness. The communicative challenges involved in describing death consciousness paralleled those Dostoevsky faced in conveying his epileptic insights. Language presupposes the very distinctions between life and death, temporal and eternal, individual and universal, that near-death consciousness transcended. Direct description inevitably reduced infinite awareness to finite conceptual formulations that missed the essential nature of the experience. His literary solution was to embed these insights within dramatic narratives that could evoke recognition of similar spiritual realities in readers without relying on abstract philosophical exposition. Characters facing death in his novels often experienced profound spiritual transformations that reflected his own insights into consciousness beyond mortality. The therapeutic applications of death consciousness provided new approaches to end-of-life care and grief counseling. If death was transformation of consciousness rather than absolute termination, then both dying persons and their survivors could find meaning and comfort that purely materialist perspectives could not provide. But this required careful balance between genuine spiritual insight and false consolation that denied the reality of loss and suffering. Dostoevsky's approach acknowledged the complete reality of temporal separation, while revealing the eternal dimension where spiritual connection transcended physical death. Death became not defeat but graduation, completion of one phase of consciousness's infinite self-exploration rather than end of existence itself. Part 12. Memory, Time and the Architecture of Personal Identity. Dostoevsky's epileptic experiences revealed that memory was far more complex and mysterious than conventional psychology assumed. During his auras, he reported access not only to his own personal memories, but to what he called cosmic memory, a vast repository of human experience that transcended individual biographical boundaries. This suggested that memory was not simply storage of personal past events, but participation in a universal consciousness that contained the complete history of human awareness. Individual memory became a particular perspective on this cosmic memory, limited by the boundaries of personal experience but capable of expanding beyond those limitations under certain conditions. His epileptic auras temporarily dissolved these boundaries, providing direct access to the deeper layers of memory that connected individual consciousness to universal human experience. The temporal structure of memory during epileptic episodes violated every principle of normal time consciousness. Past events became as vivid and present as immediate sensory experience, while future possibilities appeared as clearly as historical memories. The usual distinction between remembering the past and anticipating the future collapsed into a single mode of consciousness that Dostoevsky called eternal memory, awareness of the complete temporal pattern of existence as a unified whole. This revealed that normal time consciousness, with its sharp distinctions between past, present and future, was actually a limiting mechanism that prevented overwhelming awareness of temporal totality. The epileptic aura temporarily lifted these limitations, allowing consciousness to experience its natural, eternal condition. The relationship between memory and personal identity underwent radical revision in light of these experiences. Conventional understanding treats personal identity as continuity of memory across time, the sense that the person who experienced past events is the same person who remembers them in the present. But Dostoevsky's access to universal memory revealed that individual identity was far more fluid and expansive than this psychological continuity suggested. During his auras, he reported remembering events from lives he had never lived, experiencing memories that belonged to other people, and accessing knowledge that had no apparent source in his personal learning or cultural background. This pointed toward a deeper level of identity that transcended individual biographical boundaries, while including them as particular expressions of universal consciousness. The emotional dimensions of expanded memory created unprecedented challenges for psychological understanding. Dostoevsky reported experiencing not only universal memory, but universal emotion, feeling simultaneously all the joy and suffering that had ever been experienced by human consciousness. This was not abstract intellectual knowledge about human emotion, but direct participatory awareness of the complete emotional spectrum of human existence. He wrote that in these moments he felt the tears of every person who had ever cried, and the laughter of everyone who had ever felt joy. This explained his extraordinary capacity for psychological empathy and his ability to create characters whose emotional lives possessed such authenticity and depth. The cognitive aspects of eternal memory provided Dostoevsky with insights into the nature of learning, knowledge, and intellectual development. If consciousness had access to universal memory, then learning was not acquisition of new information, but recognition of knowledge that consciousness already possessed at deeper levels. Education became a process of awakening to truths that were eternally present, rather than accumulation of facts that were externally supplied. This explained why certain ideas could seem immediately familiar even when encountered for the first time, and why genuine understanding often felt more like recognition than discovery. The teacher's role was not to fill empty minds with information, but to awaken consciousness to knowledge it already possessed but had temporarily forgotten. The creative applications of expanded memory transformed Dostoevsky's understanding of artistic inspiration and literary composition. His novels drew not only on his personal experience and imagination, but on his epileptic access to universal human memory. Characters like Raskolnikov, Prince Mishkin, and Ivan Karamazov possessed psychological complexity and authenticity that reflected Dostoevsky's ability to remember experiences he had never personally lived. Artistic creation became a form of memory recovery, bringing to conscious expression the universal human experiences that were normally hidden beneath individual awareness. This explained why great literature could seem to reveal truths about human nature that readers recognized as familiar even when they had never consciously considered them before. The therapeutic potential of memory expansion offered new approaches to psychological healing and trauma recovery. If individual consciousness could access universal memory, then personal traumatic experiences could be understood within the context of universal human suffering and resilience. This did not minimize the reality of individual pain, but revealed its connection to the broader human experience of suffering and recovery. Healing involved not forgetting traumatic events, but expanding memory to include the universal context that could provide meaning and perspective for individual suffering. The goal was not elimination of painful memories, but integration of personal experience within the larger pattern of human spiritual development. The philosophical implications of eternal memory challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between consciousness and time. If memory could transcend the apparent limitations of sequential time and individual experience, then consciousness itself must possess dimensions that were not reducible to temporal processes. Memory became evidence for the eternal nature of consciousness rather than simply a psychological mechanism for storing past experience. The ability to remember events from universal human history suggested that consciousness participated in a timeless dimension where all experience existed simultaneously and eternally. This provided additional support for Dostoevsky's metaphysical system, where eternal consciousness was the fundamental reality and temporal experience was its limited manifestation. Part 13. Eastern Wisdom and Western Revelation, Comparative Mystical Experience. Dostoevsky's epileptic insights displayed remarkable parallels to the mystical traditions of Eastern philosophy, particularly the Hindu concept of cosmic consciousness and the Buddhist understanding of enlightenment as transcendence of ordinary temporal awareness. His description of consciousness expanding beyond individual boundaries to encompass universal existence corresponded closely to the Vedantic teaching that individual self, or Atman, is ultimately identical with universal consciousness, or Brahman. The epileptic aura's revelation of eternal presence within temporal moments paralleled the Buddhist insight into the timeless nature of pure awareness that underlies all changing phenomena. But Dostoevsky developed these insights within the framework of Russian Orthodox Christianity rather than adopting Eastern philosophical terminology, creating a unique synthesis of mystical experience and Christian theology. His contribution was showing how transcendent spiritual realization could emerge from and enrich Christian understanding rather than requiring abandonment of Western religious tradition. The relationship between individual suffering and cosmic consciousness that Dostoevsky explored through his epileptic experiences resonated strongly with the Buddhist teaching of dukkha, the universal presence of suffering within existence. But while Buddhism typically emphasized liberation from suffering through detachment from temporal experience, Dostoevsky's approach involved conscious participation in suffering as a necessary aspect of consciousness's complete self-exploration. His characters did not seek escape from temporal existence, but deeper understanding of its spiritual significance. This reflected a more incarnational spirituality that found ultimate meaning within rather than beyond the world of temporal experience. Suffering became not an obstacle to spiritual realization, but a pathway toward complete understanding of consciousness's infinite nature. The concept of karma, the moral law that connects actions across multiple lifetimes, found new interpretation in Dostoevsky's understanding of eternal consciousness, choosing its complete temporal experience. Rather than actions in past lives determining present circumstances, consciousness chose its entire life pattern from an eternal perspective that included all apparent temporal sequence. This created both ultimate responsibility for all experience and ultimate compassion for all beings, since every individual was consciousness exploring particular aspects of its infinite possibilities. The moral implications were similar to traditional karma teaching, but located choice at the eternal rather than temporal level. This avoided both fatalistic acceptance of unjust circumstances and simplistic notions of deserved punishment for past actions. The practice of meditation and contemplative disciplines found new understanding through Dostoevsky's insights into the relationship between altered consciousness and spiritual realization. His epileptic auras provided involuntary access to the same expanded awareness that contemplative traditions sought through voluntary spiritual practices. This suggested that the goal of meditation was not achievement of special states, but recognition of consciousness's eternal nature that was always present beneath ordinary awareness. Contemplative practice became training in accessing and integrating transcendent insights, rather than acquisition of supernatural powers or escape from ordinary existence. The epileptic experience demonstrated that profound spiritual realization was possible even through involuntary altered states when they were understood and integrated properly. The doctrine of reincarnation required careful analysis in light of Dostoevsky's understanding of eternal consciousness and temporal manifestation. Traditional reincarnation teachings assume linear time where consciousness moves through sequential lifetimes, accumulating experience and spiritual development. But if all temporal experience existed eternally and simultaneously, then consciousness did not move through time, but expressed itself through all possible temporal patterns simultaneously. What appeared as past and future lives from temporal perspective were actually simultaneous expressions of eternal consciousness, exploring different aspects of human possibility. This provided new understanding of why people sometimes felt connections to historical periods or cultures they had never directly encountered, since consciousness participated eternally in all human experience. The relationship between individual enlightenment and collective transformation received distinctive treatment in Dostoevsky's synthesis of mystical insight and social responsibility. Eastern traditions often emphasized individual liberation through detachment from worldly concerns and social relationships. But Dostoevsky's approach required complete engagement with temporal social existence as the necessary context for spiritual realization. Individual awakening to eternal consciousness created greater rather than lesser responsibility for alleviating temporal suffering and promoting social justice. The spiritually realized person could not withdraw from worldly concerns, but must participate more fully in them, while maintaining awareness of their eternal significance. The concept of the guru, or spiritual teacher, found new interpretation in Dostoevsky's understanding of how transcendent insights could be communicated and transmitted. Rather than relying on formal teacher-student relationships or institutional spiritual authority, he developed methods of indirect communication through literature that could awaken spiritual recognition in readers. His novels functioned as spiritual teaching that operated through imaginative engagement rather than direct instruction or formal meditation practices. This democratized access to spiritual wisdom by making it available through cultural forms that required no special training or institutional affiliation. The reader's encounter with spiritually profound literature could provide access to the same transcendent insights that traditional spiritual practices were designed to cultivate. The integration of mystical experience with intellectual and artistic activity distinguished Dostoevsky's approach from Eastern traditions that often viewed conceptual thinking and creative expression as obstacles to spiritual realization. His epileptic insights enhanced rather than replaced his capacity for philosophical analysis and literary creation. Transcendent spiritual experience became the source of deeper, rather than more limited engagement with intellectual and cultural activities. This suggested that genuine spiritual realization should enrich all dimensions of human existence, rather than requiring renunciation of mental and creative capacities. The goal was not elimination of thought and culture, but their transformation through conscious participation in the eternal creative activity that manifests itself through all forms of human expression. Part 14. German Idealism and the Phenomenology of Transcendent Experience. Dostoevsky's epileptic revelations anticipated and provided experiential validation for many insights of German idealist philosophy, particularly Hegel's understanding of absolute spirit, manifesting itself through temporal development, and Schelling's philosophy of nature as the self-revelation of infinite consciousness. His direct experience of consciousness, transcending the limitations of individual awareness and temporal sequence, corresponded to Hegel's concept of consciousness rising through successive levels of self-understanding until it recognizes itself as identical with absolute reality. But while Hegel developed these insights through logical analysis and historical interpretation, Dostoevsky's approach was grounded in direct phenomenological investigation of altered states of consciousness. This provided empirical foundation for idealist metaphysics that purely conceptual approaches could not supply, demonstrating that transcendent consciousness was not merely philosophical speculation, but lived reality accessible through appropriate conditions. His contribution was showing how idealist philosophy could be verified through first-person investigation of consciousness rather than relying solely on rational argument and cultural analysis. The relationship between finite and infinite consciousness that Dostoevsky explored through his medical condition paralleled Schelling's understanding of nature as the unconscious activity of absolute spirit becoming conscious of itself through human awareness. During his epileptic auras, individual consciousness recognized itself as a particular manifestation of universal consciousness that was simultaneously the source and destination of all temporal experience. This dissolved the apparent opposition between subjective and objective, mind and nature, individual and universal, that had troubled philosophy since Descartes. Consciousness was revealed as both the most intimate aspect of personal experience and the most universal principle of cosmic existence. The epileptic experience provided direct verification of idealist claims about the fundamental identity of consciousness and reality that purely theoretical approaches could only assert as logical necessity. Kant's transcendental philosophy received new interpretation through Dostoevsky's insights into consciousness that could transcend the normal limitations of space and time while remaining connected to temporal experience. Kant had argued that space and time were forms imposed by human consciousness rather than independent features of reality in itself. Dostoevsky's epileptic transcendence of temporal limitations provided experiential evidence for this claim, while revealing that consciousness possessed capabilities that Kant had not fully recognized. The epileptic aura demonstrated that consciousness could operate according to principles that transcended the categories of ordinary experience without losing connection to practical engagement with temporal existence. This pointed toward forms of knowledge and experience that were neither purely empirical nor purely rational, but involved direct participation in the creative activity that generates both sensory experience and conceptual understanding. The phenomenological method that would later be developed by Husserl and other philosophers found anticipation in Dostoevsky's careful description of consciousness during altered states. His detailed analysis of the temporal, spatial, emotional, and cognitive dimensions of epileptic experience provided precise phenomenological investigation of consciousness freed from normal limitations. This demonstrated the value of first-person investigation of subjective experience as a source of philosophical insight that complemented but could not be reduced to objective scientific analysis. The epileptic aura became a natural laboratory for exploring the structures of consciousness that were normally hidden beneath ordinary awareness. His literary presentations of these experiences provided phenomenological descriptions that could guide readers toward recognition of similar structures within their own consciousness. The problem of the thing in itself that had troubled Kant and subsequent German philosophers received new treatment through Dostoevsky's experience of consciousness accessing reality directly rather than through representational mediation. During his auras, consciousness seemed to transcend the subject-object distinction that normally characterized human knowledge, gaining direct access to reality rather than knowledge of appearances. This suggested that the thing in itself was not unknowable, but could be accessed through appropriate alterations in the structure of consciousness. The epileptic experience provided evidence that consciousness could transcend its normal limitations and achieve direct participation in the absolute reality that idealist philosophy had posited as the ultimate truth. This resolved the epistemological problems that had prevented German idealism from providing convincing demonstration of its metaphysical claims. The dialectical method that Hegel used to trace consciousness's development toward absolute knowledge found practical illustration in Dostoevsky's exploration of characters who struggled with the tension between finite and infinite perspectives. His novels presented consciousness moving through stages of self-understanding that paralleled Hegel's phenomenology of spirit while remaining grounded in concrete psychological and social experience. Characters like Ivan Karamazov embodied the rational consciousness that demands logical justification for transcendent truth, while figures like Alyosha represented consciousness that had achieved integration of finite and infinite perspectives. The dramatic conflicts between these different approaches to ultimate questions provided literary demonstration of the dialectical process through which consciousness comes to understand its own nature. This showed how idealist philosophy could be translated into forms that engaged human experience at emotional and imaginative as well as purely intellectual levels. The aesthetic theory of German idealism, which understood art as the sensuous presentation of absolute truth, found new expression in Dostoevsky's use of literature to communicate transcendent insights that could not be adequately expressed through conceptual analysis. His novels became what Hegel would have called concrete universals, particular narratives that embodied universal spiritual truths in forms that could be directly experienced rather than merely understood abstractly. The aesthetic experience of reading his works could provide access to the same transcendent insights that his epileptic auras had revealed directly. This demonstrated the philosophical significance of great art as a medium for spiritual realization that complemented but could not be replaced by rational investigation or mystical experience. Literature became a form of applied phenomenology that could guide consciousness toward recognition of its deeper nature through imaginative rather than purely analytical means. The political implications of German idealist philosophy, particularly Hegel's understanding of history as the progressive self-realization of absolute spirit, received critical evaluation through Dostoevsky's insights into individual consciousness and social existence. While accepting the idealist claim that ultimate reality was spiritual rather than material, he rejected attempts to identify any particular political system with the final realization of absolute spirit. His understanding of eternal consciousness suggested that spiritual realization was available to individuals within any social circumstances rather than requiring particular historical developments. This created more modest expectations for political progress, while maintaining commitment to social justice as an expression of spiritual realization rather than a means to achieve it. The goal was conscious participation in eternal truth, rather than creation of perfect temporal institutions that would eliminate the need for individual spiritual development. Part 15. The Psychology of Spiritual Transformation. Dostoevsky's epileptic experiences provided him with unique insights into the psychological mechanisms through which consciousness undergoes profound spiritual transformation. He observed that genuine spiritual change could not be achieved through willpower, rational decision, or external influence alone, but required fundamental alterations in the structure of consciousness itself. His epileptic auras demonstrated that such alterations were possible, revealing layers of awareness that were normally inaccessible to ordinary consciousness. This led him to develop what could be called transformational psychology, understanding of how consciousness could transcend its apparent limitations and access deeper dimensions of its own nature. The process involved not elimination of temporal consciousness, but expansion to include eternal awareness that provided new context for ordinary experience. The phenomenon of psychological death and rebirth that characterizes profound spiritual transformation found direct illustration in the pattern of Dostoevsky's epileptic episodes. Each aura involved temporary dissolution of ordinary self-consciousness, followed by reconstruction of personal identity that incorporated insights from the transcendent experience. This process was often traumatic, since it required abandonment of familiar ways of understanding oneself and reality, without guarantee that adequate replacements would emerge. Many of his characters undergo similar processes of psychological death and rebirth, most notably Raskolnikov, whose crime destroys his previous identity, and whose recovery involves construction of new selfhood based on spiritual rather than purely rational principles. The pattern revealed that authentic spiritual growth often required passage through phases of disintegration that could not be avoided through careful planning or gradual adjustment. The role of suffering in spiritual transformation became central to Dostoevsky's psychological understanding. He observed that consciousness often required intense disruption of its normal patterns before it would open to deeper dimensions of awareness. Suffering served not as punishment or meaningless affliction, but as catalyst that could break through the rigid structures that prevented consciousness from recognizing its true nature. This did not make suffering intrinsically valuable or justify causing unnecessary pain, but it revealed why spiritual growth often emerged from rather than in spite of difficult life circumstances. The key was learning to participate consciously in suffering rather than simply enduring it passively or attempting to avoid it completely. The integration of transcendent insights into ordinary consciousness presented complex psychological challenges that Dostoevsky explored through both personal experience and literary analysis. The epileptic aura provided access to cosmic consciousness and absolute truth, but this experience had to be integrated with the practical demands of daily existence and social relationships. The challenge was maintaining awareness of eternal dimensions without losing effectiveness within temporal circumstances. Characters like Prince Mishkin illustrated the difficulties involved, since excessive identification with transcendent perspective could lead to practical incompetence and social isolation. Successful integration required development of what he called double consciousness, ability to operate simultaneously from both eternal and temporal perspectives without losing coherence or effectiveness. The relationship between psychological pathology and spiritual insight created complex interpretive challenges that Dostoevsky addressed through careful analysis of altered states of consciousness. His epilepsy was clearly a medical condition that caused genuine suffering and practical limitations, yet it also provided access to spiritual insights that were unavailable through normal consciousness. This suggested that the distinction between mental health and mental illness was not as clear as conventional psychology assumed. Some forms of psychological disturbance might represent consciousness attempting to break through to deeper levels of awareness rather than simple malfunction of neural processes. The task was learning to distinguish between pathological symptoms that required medical treatment and spiritual experiences that required understanding and integration. The social dimensions of spiritual transformation involved complex negotiations between individual awakening and collective expectations and responsibilities. Consciousness that had undergone profound spiritual change often found itself alienated from social environments organized around purely temporal values and material concerns. But withdrawal from social engagement was not an authentic solution, since spiritual realization required expression through practical service and cultural contribution. The challenge was finding ways to participate fully in collective existence while maintaining connection to transcendent insights that others might not understand or appreciate. This required development of skills in what he called spiritual diplomacy, ability to communicate transcendent truths in forms that could be received by consciousness operating from different levels of spiritual development. The therapeutic applications of transformational psychology suggested new approaches to mental health treatment that addressed spiritual as well as psychological dimensions of human suffering. Many forms of psychological distress might reflect consciousness's yearning for transcendent meaning rather than simply chemical imbalances or environmental stress. Treatment approaches that focus solely on symptom reduction or behavioral adjustment might miss the spiritual significance of psychological symptoms and prevent authentic healing. Effective therapy required recognition of consciousness's transcendent dimensions and assistance in accessing and integrating spiritual insights that could provide ultimate context for psychological healing. The goal was not just restoration of normal functioning, but conscious participation in the spiritual development that psychological crisis often initiated. The developmental stages of spiritual transformation revealed predictable patterns that could provide guidance for individuals undergoing profound psychological and spiritual change. Dostoevsky identified typical phases, including initial spiritual awakening, disintegration of previous identity structures, dark night of the soul where transcendent insights seemed lost, gradual integration of new understanding, and stabilization of expanded consciousness. Understanding these patterns could help people recognize that apparent regression or confusion during spiritual development might be temporary phases rather than permanent failures. The process required patience with natural rhythms of growth that could not be hurried through willpower or external intervention. Spiritual transformation was ultimately a gift of grace that consciousness could prepare for, but not force through deliberate effort. Part 16. The Influence on Modern Psychology and Consciousness Studies. Dostoevsky's insights into altered states of consciousness and their relationship to spiritual experience anticipated major developments in 20th century psychology and neuroscience by several decades. His careful phenomenological descriptions of epileptic auras provided detailed analysis of transcendent consciousness that influenced later research into mystical experience, religious psychology, and the neurological basis of spiritual states. William James's groundbreaking work, The Varieties of Religious Experience, drew heavily on Dostoevsky's literary presentations of altered consciousness to develop psychological understanding of mystical experience as legitimate subject for scientific investigation. Carl Jung's concept of the collective unconscious and archetypal patterns of human experience showed clear parallels to Dostoevsky's insights into universal consciousness, accessible through individual awareness. Modern consciousness researchers like Stanislav Grof have explicitly acknowledged Dostoevsky's contributions to understanding the therapeutic potential of non-ordinary states of consciousness. The development of phenomenological psychology owed significant debt to Dostoevsky's method of careful first-person investigation of subjective experience. His detailed analysis of the temporal, spatial, emotional and cognitive dimensions of altered consciousness provided models for systematic study of subjective phenomena that complemented objective scientific approaches. Philosophers like Maurice Merleau-Ponty and psychologists like Eugene Gendlin developed methods of phenomenological investigation that built on Dostoevsky's pioneering work in describing consciousness from the inside. This established first-person experience as legitimate source of knowledge about the nature of mind and consciousness, rather than mere object for external scientific analysis. Contemporary neurophenomenology, which combines neuroscientific investigation with detailed first-person reports, represents continuation of the approach that Dostoevsky initiated through his analysis of epileptic experience. The field of transpersonal psychology emerged in part from recognition that human consciousness possessed transcendent dimensions that conventional psychology had neglected or dismissed as pathological. Dostoevsky's demonstrations that altered states could provide access to expanded awareness and spiritual insight rather than simple dysfunction challenged reductive approaches to unusual psychological experiences. Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs and concept of self-actualization showed influence from Dostoevsky's understanding that human beings possessed spiritual potentials that transcended basic psychological and social adjustment. Roberto Assagioli's psychosynthesis explicitly incorporated insights about higher consciousness and spiritual development that paralleled Dostoevsky's investigations into the relationship between individual and universal awareness. These approaches recognized that mental health should include spiritual development rather than limiting treatment to elimination of symptoms and restoration of conventional functioning. The study of creativity and artistic inspiration found new direction through Dostoevsky's insights into the relationship between altered consciousness and creative expression. His experience of accessing universal memory and cosmic consciousness during epileptic auras provided understanding of how artistic creation could draw on sources of inspiration that transcended individual knowledge and experience. Psychologists studying creativity began to recognize that great artistic achievement often involved temporary alterations in normal consciousness that allowed access to deeper layers of awareness. This led to investigation of flow states, peak experiences, and other altered conditions that enhanced rather than impaired creative capacity. Contemporary research into the neuroscience of creativity has confirmed that artistic inspiration involves changes in brain activity that parallel some aspects of Dostoevsky's descriptions of epileptic consciousness. The development of depth psychology and psychoanalytic approaches to unconscious mental processes showed complex relationships to Dostoevsky's insights into the multi-layered nature of consciousness. While Freud focused primarily on unconscious material that was repressed or sublimated, Dostoevsky's approach emphasized unconscious dimensions that were transcendent rather than merely personal. Jung's concept of the collective unconscious and his interest in mystical experience showed clearer parallels to Dostoevsky's understanding of universal consciousness accessible through individual awareness. But both approaches recognized that consciousness possessed depths and complexities that surface awareness could not fully comprehend or control. This established investigation of unconscious processes as central to understanding human psychology and spiritual development. The emergence of cognitive neuroscience and brain imaging technologies provided new tools for investigating the neurological basis of the consciousness states that Dostoevsky had explored through direct experience. Modern research has confirmed that temporal lobe epilepsy can produce the types of experiences he described, involving alterations in temporal perception, expanded sense of meaning and significance, and feelings of cosmic unity. Studies of meditation, psychedelic experiences, and near-death states have revealed similar patterns of brain activity that support Dostoevsky's claims about consciousness transcending normal limitations. But neuroscientific findings raise the same interpretive questions that Dostoevsky had grappled with about the relationship between brain states and consciousness. Does altered brain activity produce transcendent experience? Or does expanded consciousness manifest through neurological changes that make such experiences possible? The practical applications of Dostoevsky's insights in therapeutic and educational contexts continue to develop as psychology recognizes the importance of meaning, purpose, and spiritual development in human well-being. Approaches like logotherapy, existential psychology, and mindfulness-based therapies incorporate understanding that psychological healing often requires attention to transcendent dimensions of human experience. Educational methods that recognize multiple intelligences and different learning styles reflect insights about consciousness that Dostoevsky had developed through his investigations of altered awareness. The growing integration of contemplative practices with psychological treatment and educational approaches represents continuation of his work in bridging spiritual experience and practical application. His fundamental insight that consciousness possesses dimensions beyond ordinary awareness continues to influence contemporary approaches to human development and healing. Part 17. Contemporary Relevance and the Crisis of Meaning. Dostoevsky's insights into eternal consciousness and the transcendent dimensions of human experience have gained renewed relevance in contemporary culture, struggling with what he presciently identified as the spiritual consequences of materialist reductionism. His predictions about the nihilistic implications of rejecting transcendent meaning have proven remarkably accurate in describing the psychological and social crises that characterize modern secular civilization. The epidemic of depression, anxiety, and existential emptiness that affects developed societies reflects the spiritual vacuum that Dostoevsky warned would result from consciousness identifying exclusively with temporal and material existence. His epileptic revelations about eternal consciousness provide resources for addressing these contemporary crises by revealing dimensions of human nature that purely secular approaches cannot recognize or cultivate. The task is translating his insights into forms that can serve contemporary needs without requiring acceptance of his specific religious or metaphysical commitments. The technological transformation of human consciousness through digital media and artificial intelligence creates new urgency for understanding the relationship between individual awareness and universal consciousness that Dostoevsky explored through his medical condition. Contemporary concerns about technology replacing human intelligence and social media fragmenting authentic personal relationships reflect deeper anxieties about consciousness losing connection to its transcendent dimensions. Dostoevsky's insights suggest that technological development becomes spiritually destructive, when it reduces consciousness to information processing rather than recognizing its creative and transcendent capacities. But technology could also serve spiritual purposes if it were designed to enhance rather than replace the contemplative and creative activities through which consciousness realizes its deeper nature. The key is maintaining awareness of consciousness's eternal dimensions, while engaging creatively with technological possibilities. The environmental crisis and climate change represent contemporary expressions of the spiritual crisis that Dostoevsky analyzed through his understanding of consciousness alienated from its eternal foundation. Materialist culture that treats nature as mere resource for human consumption reflects the same reductive consciousness that reduces human beings to biological machines responding to environmental stimuli. Environmental healing requires recognition of consciousness's participation in the cosmic creative activity that generates and sustains all natural processes. Dostoevsky's insights into eternal consciousness suggest that authentic environmental responsibility emerges from spiritual recognition of consciousness's unity with all existence, rather than from purely rational calculations about resource management and technological solutions. This provides foundation for environmental ethics that transcends both anthropocentric exploitation and misanthropic rejection of human cultural development. The political polarization and social fragmentation that characterize contemporary democratic societies reflect the loss of shared spiritual foundations that can unite people across ideological differences. Dostoevsky's understanding of eternal consciousness as the common foundation of all individual awareness provides resources for political reconciliation that purely secular approaches cannot supply. Recognition that political opponents are ultimately expressions of the same universal consciousness could create empathy and mutual respect that transcends partisan divisions. But this requires spiritual maturity that can maintain commitment to justice and truth while recognizing the eternal dignity of those who hold different temporal perspectives. Political engagement becomes spiritual practice that serves consciousness's self-realization rather than mere competition for power and resources. The crisis in traditional religious institutions and the rise of spiritual but not religious identity reflects widespread hunger for transcendent meaning, combined with suspicion of institutional authority that Dostoevsky anticipated in his critique of ecclesiastical Christianity. His approach to spirituality, that emphasized direct access to eternal consciousness rather than mediation through religious institutions, provides models for authentic spiritual life that transcends traditional institutional boundaries. But this individualistic approach requires balance with recognition that spiritual development occurs within communities and cultural traditions that preserve and transmit wisdom across generations. The challenge is maintaining connection to traditional spiritual resources while remaining open to direct spiritual experience that transcends any particular institutional form. This requires spiritual maturity that can appreciate institutional wisdom without becoming dependent on external authority for access to transcendent truth. The globalization of human culture and communication creates both opportunities and challenges for consciousness development that Dostoevsky's insights can help illuminate. Global awareness of human diversity and cultural achievement could serve spiritual development by revealing the infinite creativity of consciousness, expressing itself through different historical and geographical circumstances. But globalization can also lead to cultural homogenization and loss of the local traditions and practices that have historically provided contexts for spiritual development. Dostoevsky's understanding suggests that authentic globalization should celebrate rather than eliminate cultural diversity while recognizing the universal spiritual principles that underlie all genuine cultural achievement. This requires consciousness mature enough to appreciate both universal truth and particular cultural expressions without reducing either to the other. The therapeutic applications of Dostoevsky's insights have particular relevance for contemporary mental health challenges that often reflect spiritual as well as psychological dimensions. The epidemic of depression and anxiety in developed societies may reflect consciousness's yearning for transcendent meaning in cultures that provide only material and social satisfactions. Treatment approaches that address only psychological symptoms without recognizing spiritual dimensions may provide temporary relief without facilitating authentic healing. Dostoevsky's understanding of consciousness's transcendent nature suggests that mental health requires attention to meaning, purpose, and spiritual development, as well as symptom management and behavioral change. This does not require adoption of traditional religious beliefs, but it does require recognition that human consciousness possesses dimensions that purely secular psychology cannot adequately address. The educational implications of Dostoevsky's insights have particular importance for preparing future generations to navigate the complex challenges of technological civilization while maintaining connection to transcendent sources of meaning and value. Educational approaches that focus solely on information transmission and skill development may fail to cultivate the spiritual maturity required for wise engagement with unprecedented historical challenges. Education needs to address consciousness development and spiritual maturation, as well as intellectual and practical preparation for economic and social participation. This requires educational methods that can recognize and cultivate the transcendent dimensions of human consciousness that Dostoevsky revealed through his investigations of altered awareness. The goal is not indoctrination into particular spiritual beliefs, but development of consciousness capable of accessing transcendent wisdom while engaging effectively with temporal responsibilities and opportunities. Part 18. The Future of Human Consciousness. Dostoevsky's epileptic revelations about the eternal dimensions of consciousness provide profound insights into the future evolutionary possibilities of human awareness. His experience of consciousness transcending the normal limitations of time, space, and individual identity suggests that what we consider ordinary human consciousness may represent only a preliminary stage in consciousness development. The epileptic aura revealed capacities for cosmic awareness, universal memory, and transcendent understanding that could potentially become accessible to human beings generally, rather than remaining exceptional experiences available only through medical conditions or intensive spiritual practice. This points toward evolutionary possibilities for consciousness development that could transform human civilization as profoundly as the development of language, writing, and scientific thinking have transformed previous stages of cultural evolution. The question is whether humanity can develop these capacities voluntarily through conscious effort, or whether they will emerge only through crisis and disruption of normal consciousness patterns. The relationship between technological development and consciousness evolution presents complex challenges and opportunities that Dostoevsky's insights can help illuminate. Artificial intelligence and brain-computer interfaces could potentially provide technological access to some of the expanded awareness capabilities that Dostoevsky experienced through epileptic episodes. But technological enhancement of consciousness raises fundamental questions about the relationship between authentic spiritual development and artificial augmentation of human capacities. Dostoevsky's understanding suggests that genuine consciousness expansion requires integration of transcendent insights with moral and spiritual maturation, rather than simple amplification of cognitive processing power. The challenge is ensuring that technological development serves rather than replaces the organic spiritual development that leads to wisdom and compassion, as well as expanded awareness. The potential for collective consciousness evolution represents one of the most intriguing implications of Dostoevsky's insights into universal consciousness accessible through individual awareness. If individual consciousness can expand to encompass cosmic awareness, this suggests possibilities for collective human consciousness that could transcend the limitations of current social and political organization. Global communication technologies already create unprecedented possibilities for shared awareness and collective intelligence that could serve as technological foundation for higher forms of social consciousness. But realizing these possibilities requires spiritual as well as technological development, cultivation of wisdom and compassion that can guide the application of enhanced collective capabilities. The goal would be emergence of what could be called conscious civilization, human society organized around recognition of consciousness's transcendent dimensions rather than purely material and competitive concerns. The environmental implications of consciousness evolution could provide solutions to ecological crises that purely technological and political approaches cannot achieve. Dostoevsky's insights into consciousness's participation in cosmic creative activity suggest that environmental healing requires spiritual as well as practical transformation of human relationship with natural processes. Consciousness that recognizes its eternal dimensions would naturally develop ecological wisdom that treats environmental protection as spiritual practice rather than external obligation. This could lead to economic and social systems that serve both human development and environmental sustainability because they would be based on recognition of consciousness's unity with all existence. The result could be truly sustainable civilization that enhances rather than threatens the natural systems that support all life on Earth. The educational transformation required for consciousness evolution would involve fundamental changes in how human beings understand learning, development, and the purposes of education. Current educational systems focus primarily on information transmission and skill development for economic participation rather than consciousness development and spiritual maturation. Education designed to cultivate the consciousness capacities that Dostoevsky revealed would emphasize contemplative practices, creative expression, and service to others as core elements of human development. This would require educational approaches that address intellectual, emotional, physical, and spiritual dimensions of human nature as integrated aspects of consciousness development. The goal would be preparation for conscious participation in the evolutionary transformation of human civilization, rather than simply adaptation to existing social and economic structures. The therapeutic implications of consciousness evolution suggest possibilities for healing approaches that address the deepest sources of human suffering and limitation. If consciousness can access its eternal dimensions through appropriate conditions and practices, this could provide resources for healing that transcend the current limitations of medical and psychological treatment. Mental illness, addiction, and other forms of psychological suffering might be addressed through methods that reconnect consciousness with its transcendent foundation rather than focusing solely on symptom management and behavioral adjustment. This does not mean abandoning conventional medical treatment, but supplementing it with approaches that recognize and cultivate the spiritual dimensions of healing and development. The result could be healthcare systems that serve human flourishing, rather than just disease prevention and symptom relief. The scientific implications of consciousness evolution could lead to new forms of research and investigation that integrate first-person and third-person approaches to understanding reality. Dostoevsky's method of careful phenomenological investigation of altered consciousness anticipated developments in consciousness studies that recognize subjective experience as legitimate source of knowledge about the nature of mind and reality. Future science might develop methods for systematic investigation of consciousness that combine objective measurement with disciplined first-person exploration of subjective phenomena. This could lead to scientific understanding that transcends the current limitations of both materialist reductionism and religious dogmatism by providing empirical access to the transcendent dimensions of existence that Dostoevsky revealed through his epileptic investigations. The result could be integral science that serves both practical applications and spiritual understanding as complementary aspects of human relationship with truth. The ultimate significance of Dostoevsky's insights for the future of human consciousness lies in their demonstration that what we consider normal human awareness represents only a fraction of consciousness's true capacities and potential. His epileptic revelations provided empirical evidence that consciousness can transcend every apparent limitation while remaining grounded in practical engagement with temporal existence. This suggests that human evolution has reached a stage where further development will be primarily consciousness evolution rather than biological adaptation to environmental pressures. The challenge is learning to cultivate voluntarily the expanded awareness capacities that Dostoevsky accessed involuntarily through his medical condition. Success in this evolutionary project could transform human civilization as profoundly as the development of self-reflective consciousness transformed our ancestors from biological organisms responding to environmental pressures into cultural beings capable of creating meaning and purpose through conscious choice and creative expression. Part 19. Practical Applications and Contemplative Practices. The translation of Dostoevsky's insights into practical methods for consciousness development requires careful analysis of the conditions that facilitated his access to transcendent awareness. While epileptic seizures cannot be recommended as spiritual practices, the consciousness states they produced can be approached through voluntary contemplative disciplines that create similar conditions of expanded awareness. His descriptions of consciousness transcending temporal limitations suggest that meditation practices focused on present moment awareness could provide access to the eternal dimension he experienced during epileptic auras. But such practices must be approached with understanding that their goal is not escape from temporal existence, but conscious participation in the eternal creative activity that manifests itself through temporal experience. The key is developing what he called double consciousness, ability to maintain awareness of both eternal and temporal dimensions simultaneously rather than alternating between them. The development of memory practices based on Dostoevsky's insights into cosmic memory could provide methods for accessing universal human wisdom through individual consciousness. His experience of remembering events he had never personally experienced suggests that consciousness has access to collective human knowledge that transcends individual learning and cultural conditioning. Contemplative practices that involve systematic exploration of memory could potentially access these deeper layers of awareness that connect individual consciousness to universal human experience. This would require approaches that go beyond personal biographical memory to explore the archetypal patterns and universal themes that underlie all human experience. The goal would be development of wisdom that draws on the complete heritage of human spiritual and cultural development rather than being limited to individual experience and cultural background. The cultivation of what Dostoevsky called conscious love provides practical methods for developing the universal compassion he experienced during his transcendent states. His insight that all apparent individuals are expressions of the same eternal consciousness suggests that authentic love recognizes the ultimate unity underlying surface differences and conflicts. This could be cultivated through practices that systematically extend compassion beyond personal preferences and tribal loyalties to include all beings as expressions of the same universal consciousness. Such practices would involve both contemplative exercises that cultivate emotional expansion and practical service activities that express universal compassion through concrete action. The goal is not sentimental emotion, but recognition of the literal truth about consciousness's fundamental unity that naturally expresses itself as compassionate action. The development of creative practices based on Dostoevsky's understanding of artistic inspiration as participation in cosmic creativity could provide methods for accessing transcendent dimensions through cultural activities. His insight that creativity involves consciousness participating in the eternal creative activity that generates all existence suggests that artistic practice can serve spiritual development as well as cultural expression. This requires approaches to creative activity that emphasize receptivity to inspiration beyond individual imagination, rather than focusing solely on technical skill and personal expression. Creative practice becomes spiritual discipline when it serves consciousness, exploration rather than ego enhancement or commercial success. The goal is developing capacity for what could be called conscious creativity, artistic expression that channels transcendent insights into forms that can awaken similar awareness in others. The application of Dostoevsky's insights to healing practices suggests therapeutic approaches that address spiritual dimensions of suffering as well as psychological and physical symptoms. His understanding that consciousness chooses its complete temporal experience for spiritual purposes points toward healing methods that help people discover the meaning and purpose inherent in their particular challenges and limitations. This does not mean avoiding medical treatment or accepting unnecessary suffering, but finding ways to participate consciously in the spiritual development that difficult experiences can facilitate. Healing becomes collaboration with consciousness's own wisdom rather than external intervention that eliminates symptoms without addressing their deeper significance. The goal is not just restoration of normal functioning, but conscious participation in the spiritual purposes that illness and suffering can serve when understood properly. The development of contemplative reading practices based on Dostoevsky's literary methods could provide access to transcendent insights through engagement with spiritually profound texts. His novels were designed to evoke expanded consciousness in readers through imaginative participation in characters' spiritual struggles and realizations. This suggests possibilities for reading practices that engage literature as spiritual discipline rather than mere entertainment or intellectual analysis. Such practices would involve meditative engagement with texts that allows their spiritual insights to awaken similar recognition in the reader's consciousness. The goal is using great literature as guidance for consciousness development rather than simply appreciating it as cultural achievement or artistic expression. The integration of Dostoevsky's insights with contemporary psychological and spiritual practices requires careful balance between respecting traditional wisdom and adapting it to contemporary needs and understanding. His spiritual insights emerged from specifically Christian cultural context, but address universal dimensions of consciousness that transcend any particular religious tradition. The challenge is translating these insights into forms that can serve people from diverse cultural backgrounds without losing their essential spiritual significance. This requires approaches that honor both universal spiritual principles and particular cultural expressions, while remaining open to new forms of practice that serve contemporary consciousness development needs. The goal is practical wisdom that can guide consciousness development while respecting the diversity of paths through which different individuals can access transcendent awareness. The community dimensions of consciousness development require social contexts that can support and guide individual practice while creating collective conditions for spiritual growth. Dostoevsky's insights suggest that consciousness development occurs most effectively within communities that share commitment to transcendent values, while respecting individual differences in spiritual temperament and development level. This points toward needs for new forms of spiritual community that can serve consciousness development without requiring adherence to specific doctrinal beliefs or institutional authorities. Such communities would emphasize shared practice and mutual support for spiritual development rather than common intellectual positions or cultural identities. The goal is creating social conditions that facilitate rather than hinder individual access to the transcendent dimensions of consciousness that Dostoevsky revealed through his extraordinary experiences. Part 20. The Eternal Second as Gateway to Ultimate Reality. The culminating insight of Dostoevsky's epileptic revelations was his recognition that a single moment of temporal experience, when consciousness is properly attuned, can contain infinite depth and eternal significance. The eternal second was not simply a mystical experience, but a doorway into the fundamental structure of reality itself, where every temporal moment participates in eternal being. This revelation transformed his understanding of the relationship between time and eternity, from philosophical speculation into lived reality that could be verified through direct conscious experience. The implications extend far beyond individual spiritual realization to encompass the deepest questions about the nature of existence, consciousness, and ultimate reality that have occupied philosophers, theologians, and scientists throughout human history. His contribution was demonstrating that these ultimate questions could be approached through careful investigation of consciousness itself, rather than relying solely on rational argument, empirical observation, or traditional religious authority. The metaphysical significance of the eternal second lies in its revelation of time as the moving image of eternity rather than an independent dimension within which events occur. During his epileptic auras, Dostoevsky experienced each moment as containing the fullness of temporal existence while simultaneously transcending all temporal limitations. This suggested that eternity was not endless duration, but a dimension of depth within every temporal moment that ordinary consciousness fails to recognize. The eternal second became a gateway through which consciousness could access the timeless foundation that underlies all temporal experience without escaping from practical engagement with changing circumstances. This resolved the traditional opposition between time and eternity by revealing them as complementary aspects of a more fundamental reality that encompasses both temporal sequence and eternal presence. The epistemological implications of the eternal second challenge conventional approaches to knowledge that assume truth must be discovered through gradual accumulation of information or logical analysis of concepts. Dostoevsky's experience suggested that ultimate truth was accessible through direct conscious realization that could occur instantaneously when appropriate conditions were present. The eternal second provided complete understanding of existence that was simultaneously immediate and comprehensive, particular and universal, temporal and eternal. This pointed toward forms of knowledge that transcended the limitations of both empirical investigation and rational analysis, by providing direct participation in the truth they sought to understand. But such knowledge could not be communicated directly through ordinary language or conceptual formulation, requiring instead the indirect methods of art, literature, and contemplative practice that could evoke similar recognition in others. The theological significance of the eternal second provided Dostoevsky with new understanding of divine presence within temporal existence that transcended traditional distinctions between sacred and secular, natural and supernatural. God was not a separate being who intervened in temporal events from external transcendent realm, but the eternal dimension of consciousness that was always present within every moment of experience. The eternal second revealed that what religious traditions called divine presence was actually the deepest level of consciousness's own nature rather than external spiritual reality. This created radically immanent theology, where spiritual realization involved recognizing, rather than achieving, divine consciousness, awakening to what was eternally present, rather than acquiring something foreign to human nature. But this immanence did not eliminate transcendence, since consciousness's eternal dimension infinitely exceeded the limitations of individual personality and temporal circumstances. The psychological significance of the eternal second provided new understanding of mental health and human development as consciousness recognizing and actualizing its transcendent potential. Psychological suffering often reflected consciousness's alienation from its eternal foundation rather than simply chemical imbalances or environmental stress. The eternal second demonstrated that consciousness possessed capacities for joy, understanding and creative expression that transcended any particular life circumstances or personal limitations. This suggested therapeutic approaches that focused on helping people access their own transcendent dimensions, rather than simply adjusting them to social expectations or eliminating troublesome symptoms. Mental health became conscious participation in eternal creativity rather than mere absence of psychological distress or successful adaptation to temporal circumstances. The social implications of the eternal second pointed toward possibilities for human community based on recognition of consciousness's universal foundation rather than shared material interests or cultural identities. If every individual could potentially access the eternal dimension where all apparent diversity was revealed as expressions of unified consciousness, this could provide basis for social cooperation that transcended ethnic, national, and ideological divisions. The eternal second suggested that authentic human community required spiritual as well as political and economic development, cultivation of consciousness mature enough to recognize eternal unity while respecting temporal diversity. This did not eliminate the importance of justice, democracy and material welfare, but placed these temporal concerns within eternal context that could provide ultimate guidance for social development. Society became vehicle for consciousness's collective self-realization rather than mere arrangement for managing competing individual interests. The artistic implications of the eternal second revealed the deepest purposes of creative expression as making eternal truth accessible through temporal forms that could awaken transcendent recognition in others. Great art was not simply personal expression or cultural achievement, but participation in the eternal creative activity that continuously generates all existence. The Eternal Second showed that artistic inspiration involved consciousness accessing its cosmic creative capacity rather than manipulating existing materials according to individual preferences or social conventions. This explained why authentic artistic creation could seem to come from beyond the artist's personal knowledge and intention, while nevertheless expressing the deepest truth about human experience. Art became spiritual practice that served consciousness development for both creator and audience rather than mere entertainment or cultural decoration. The ultimate legacy of Dostoevsky's insights into the Eternal Second lies in their demonstration that human consciousness possesses unlimited potential for transcendence while remaining grounded in practical engagement with temporal existence. The Eternal Second was not escape from ordinary reality, but discovery of its infinite depth and ultimate significance. This provides hope that humanity can develop beyond its current limitations, while maintaining connection to the practical responsibilities and creative opportunities that temporal existence provides. The goal is not elimination of time, but conscious participation in the eternal creative activity that expresses itself through temporal development. Dostoevsky's greatest gift to human understanding was his demonstration that every person possesses access to this eternal dimension through the simple fact of being conscious, making transcendent spiritual realization a universal human possibility rather than special privilege reserved for extraordinary individuals. The Eternal Second remains available to anyone willing to investigate consciousness deeply enough to discover the infinite treasure hidden within the most ordinary moment of aware existence.